The day the arrest was announced, Fort Wayne felt like the air had been punched out of its lungs. People walked out of their homes with their hands over their mouths, whispering the same question again and again. How could it be him? For nearly 4 decades, families in that town lived with a quiet ache, telling their children to stay close, locking doors earlier than usual, carrying the weight of a missing girl they never stopped hoping and would walk back through her parents' front door. But on that day in 2023, hope wasn't what people felt. It was anger, a burning, bitter kind, the kind that comes when you find out the danger you feared wasn't a stranger wandering in from somewhere far away, but a man who had lived among them. A man who waved to neighbors, fixed cars in his driveway, and attended barbecues like everyone else. A man they trusted. Rachel Donnelly's name echoed through the town all over again, but this time with a tremble. 14 years old. A girl who carried more dreams in her camera than most adults carried in their entire lives. She vanished on a quiet September night, and for years people comforted themselves by believing it must have been someone passing through, someone who slipped into town and slipped back out before sunrise. But the truth cut far deeper. When the police released the name of the man they believed had taken Rachel, the whole community froze. Not because they didn't know him, because they did. He was part of their world. He had blended into their routines, their roads, their gatherings, their memories. And every parent who once searched the streets for Rachel felt a wave of fury crash over them. Because the answer was never far away. It had been standing beside them the whole time. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. To understand the shock of that arrest, you have to return to the night everything went wrong. September 12th, 86. A warm evening, quiet, calm, nothing unusual. Rachel Donnelly stepped out of her house with a denim jacket, a book bag, and the kind of excitement only a young girl with big dreams could carry. She told her parents she was heading to the library. It was close, safe, familiar. The sort of walk that shouldn't have required a second thought. But she never made it. Hours passed. Lights stayed on in the Donnelly home long after other houses went dark. Her mother stared out the window, convincing herself she'd see Rachel's outline coming down the street. When the phone call came, Chloe saying she hadn't seen Rachel at all, fear hit the family like a brick. By morning, the whole community was out searching. Strangers held flashlights. Parents gripped their children tighter. And then the police found Rachel's book bag abandoned near the old Central Railroad line, a place she had no reason to be. Inside was a school textbook and a roll of undeveloped film. That tiny roll should have meant something, should have opened a path, should have sparked answers. But back then, technology failed them. The print on the film canister was too faint, too worn down. A frustrating reminder that even evidence can feel cruel. For years, people replayed that night in their heads. Where did she go? Who took her? How did nobody see anything? They blamed the shadows, the darkness, the unknown. They never blamed the man who smiled at them the next morning. What no one realized was that the truth wasn't missing. It was ignored. It was waiting. And one overlooked detail on that film canister was the key that would tear a hole through a 40-year lie. Cases like this hide in plain sight. Subscribe so you don't stay unaware. If you won't subscribe, comment why you're risking missing stories like this. For nearly 4 decades, the Donnelly family lived inside a wound that never closed. Rachel's mother aged with the kind of pain that steals pieces of your life. Her father held on to routines because routines were the only thing he could control. Every birthday they marked without her was another reminder that someone, somewhere, had taken something priceless from them and walked away without consequence. The community felt that loss too. It lingered in conversations, in warnings parents repeated to their kids, in the side glances given to unfamiliar cars parked too close to the sidewalk. But over time, the case shifted from active fear to silent mourning. People stopped expecting clarity. They simply learned how to live around the emptiness. What hurt the most was not knowing whether Rachel suffered, not knowing where she was, not knowing why no one came forward, and worst of all, not knowing who had blended back into the town as if nothing had happened. Fort Wayne didn't just lose a child, it lost its sense of safety. But everything changed in 2023 when Detective Marcus Bell, a man known for refusing to accept a dead end, reopened the case file. He wasn't a part of the original investigation. He hadn't walked those streets in 19N, but he looked at that worn folder, those faded photographs, and that overlooked film canister with a determination that the town had forgotten. To everyone else, the decades-old fingerprint on that canister looked useless, a smudge from another lifetime. But Bell had access to tools that didn't exist back then. And more importantly, he had something the case hadn't seen in years. Fresh eyes and a refusal to let Rachel be forgotten. It only took one detail, one fragment of truth to start pulling at a thread the town never thought would move. And the moment it did, everything began to crack. Detective Bell didn't talk much about the moment everything shifted, but those who worked with him said his expression changed the second he zoomed in on the restored fingerprint. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't excitement. It was anger, quiet, controlled, the kind that comes from realizing a child's truth had been sitting in an evidence drawer for almost 40 years, waiting for someone who actually cared enough to see it. That fingerprint, small, faded, almost dismissed, held the entire case hostage for decades. But once Bell restored enough of its shape, the system flagged something unexpected. A distant genetic match. Not a direct hit, but close enough to build a family trail. He followed it with the patience of someone who understood the weight of every step. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The trail didn't lead out of town. It didn't point to a stranger passing through. It circled back to someone who had lived comfortably in Fort Wayne all along. Someone who watched the search teams walk past. Someone who heard the Donnellys' cries for answers and said nothing. Someone who built a life on top of a stolen one. And when Bell reached the final name, he felt the same shock the entire community would feel weeks later: Silas Vance. Not a shadowy outsider, not an unknown threat. The older brother of Rachel's friend, a man trusted by families, a man who moved through the town without a hint of guilt showing on his face. That discovery didn't just reopen a case. It reopened a wound the town had learned to carry in silence. Because the truth was never lost. It was hidden in plain view. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Fort Wayne had grown used to carrying its grief quietly. The missing posters had faded, the news vans had long disappeared, and the world had moved forward. But on one morning in 2023, when the police department announced an arrest in the Rachel Donnelly case, the town snapped awake as if the past had kicked its door open. Neighbors stepped outside with disbelief written all over their faces. Some whispered, some cried, and some simply stood frozen with the kind of shock that only comes when a community realizes it hadn't been living with uncertainty. It had been living beside a lie. People kept repeating the same question: how could it be him? For years, parents warned their kids to stay close. They blamed passing strangers, quiet roads, lonely corners of the neighborhood. Not once did they suspect a man who nodded at them at the grocery store, offered directions, gave polite smiles, and lived a calm, unremarkable life. A man who had been there through it all. The news hit the Donnelly family even harder. They had carried their pain through decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays that never felt complete. Rachel's mother aged with the kind of guilt no parent should ever feel. The guilt of not knowing whether she could have done something more. Her father's voice grew thinner with time, not because he forgot her, but because speaking about her hurt too much. And now, the name of the man responsible wasn't coming from some faraway place. It came from inside the community, a name familiar enough to feel like a betrayal. But to understand why this revelation tore open old wounds, we have to go back to the night when everything changed. September 12th, 1986 had been warm, quiet, and deceptively ordinary. 14-year-old Rachel Donnelly stepped out of her home with a denim jacket, a book bag, and the kind of excitement only a young girl with dreams stitched into every heartbeat could hold. She told her parents she was meeting her friend Chloe at the library. It was a short walk, safe, familiar, one she'd taken countless times. But Rachel never reached that library. When 10 o'clock came and the Donnelly home was still empty, the first strands of fear crept into her parents' voices. Her mother paced the living room, glancing at the door every few minutes. Her father dialed every number he could think of. When Chloe confirmed Rachel never arrived, the dread sharpened instantly. By sunrise, the entire town was searching. Flashlights cut through the early morning haze. Volunteers covered every corner they could. Parents gripped their children tighter. And then came the discovery that stopped everyone cold. Rachel's book bag lying near the old Central Railroad line, a route she had no reason to walk. Inside were her school textbook and a roll of undeveloped film. To most people, that film roll was just a heartbreaking reminder of the future Rachel never got to finish capturing. But to investigators, it was a clue that felt promising. Until it wasn't. The fingerprint on the canister was worn down to the point where the technology of that time couldn't read it. No match, no lead, no answers. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and then into decades. The Donnellys learned to live with a pain that never backed down. Every time a new officer inherited the case, they reopened the file with hope before eventually closing it again. People in Fort Wayne carried a quiet anger, anger at themselves for not seeing something, anger at the world for not giving the family justice, and anger at whoever had harmed Rachel for walking free for so long. But the wound didn't fade. It just settled deeper. And then, nearly 40 years later, something changed. Detective Marcus Bell joined the cold case unit in 2023. He wasn't tied to the mistakes of the past. He didn't accept the idea of nothing more could be done. When he opened Rachel's file, he noticed what others had overlooked, that partial fingerprint on the film canister. To most, it was a dead end. To him, it was unfinished business. Bell had access to newer tools, technology that didn't exist in 1986, and he used every resource available to bring clarity to something that had haunted the town for decades. He enlarged the print, restored sections, analyzed patterns, and pushed the system as far as it would go. Eventually, the fingerprint wasn't perfect, but it was readable enough to run through advanced databases. That's when the first surprise hit. Instead of identifying a suspect, the system pointed to a distant genetic match, a relative. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to build a path. Bell followed that trail slowly, carefully, step by step, until it landed on a name that should have brought comfort, but instead delivered a blow no one expected. Silas Vance. A name the community knew. A man who had lived among them without a flicker of suspicion. A man whose sister Chloe was the same girl Rachel thought she was meeting the night she vanished. A man who helped search for Rachel with a straight face and steady hands. Bell felt his stomach tighten when the data pointed straight at him. Not because he doubted it, but because of what it meant for the town he had sworn to protect. A child had been taken, a family had been crushed, and all this time the truth had been walking through Fort Wayne like it belonged there. The discovery didn't just break the case, it broke the community. Because the danger they feared hadn't come from outside. It had been part of their daily lives. Cases like this hide in plain sight. Subscribe so you don't stay unaware. If you won't subscribe, comment why you're risking missing stories like this. The anger, the shame, the disbelief, everything surged back when the arrest was announced. People questioned their own memories. Parents who had let their children play near the Vance home felt sick. And the Donnellys, they were forced to relive every unanswered question they had carried through a lifetime. All because one man kept a secret that stole decades from everyone around him. When Detective Bell reached his conclusion, he wasn't proud. He wasn't relieved. He was furious, because the evidence had been waiting for someone willing to look deeper, someone who refused to give up. One tiny detail, the fingerprint on that forgotten canister, ended a lie that lasted nearly 40 years. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. When the clock on the Donnellys' living room wall hit 10:07 p.m., the worry that had been sitting quietly in Eleanor's chest turned into something sharp. Rachel had never stayed out late without calling. Never. Patrick tried to steady the room with hopeful phrases, but even he kept glancing at the front door as if willing their daughter to walk through it. By 10:30, Eleanor was pacing from window to window, her hands trembling each time she moved the curtains aside. Patrick finally called Chloe's house. The silence that followed Chloe's mother picking up the phone didn't last long, but it felt endless. When Chloe came on the line and said she hadn't seen Rachel at all that evening, Eleanor felt her knees weaken. That one sentence shattered any illusion that this was a simple misunderstanding. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Minutes later, officers arrived and began retracing the short path Rachel should have taken to the library. Their flashlights swept across yards, sidewalks, and the narrow stretch of road that Rachel had walked so many times. It was supposed to be a straight, safe route, nothing strange, nothing complicated. Yet somehow, somewhere along that familiar path, Rachel had vanished without a sound. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People stepped outside in their night clothes, grabbing coats, boots, and flashlights. Parents who barely knew the Donnellys showed up ready to help. The library steps were checked. The side streets were checked. Even the shortcut Rachel never took was checked twice. But every searcher felt the same dread growing inside them. There was no sign of her. By midnight, the fear gripping the town had turned into a desperate urgency. Officers widened the search radius. Volunteers fanned out. Traffic was stopped and questioned. Every passing minute deepened the hollow ache forming in the Donnelly household. And then came the discovery that made the air turn cold. Rachel's book bag, lying abandoned near the old Central Railroad line, far from the place she said she was going, far from anywhere she should have been. It didn't make sense. And that confusion was only the beginning. When officers reached the abandoned book bag, the quiet dread of the night snapped into a harsher reality. The bag was lying near the trailhead of the old Central Railroad stretch, a place Rachel had no reason to walk toward. The officers exchanged looks, not because they understood what it meant, but because they didn't. Everything about its location contradicted the story Chloe confirmed earlier. Patrick arrived moments later, breathless and unsteady. He recognized the faded stitching on the bag immediately. Eleanor wasn't far behind, and the sound she made when she saw it broke every heart within earshot. Parents shouldn't have to stare at an object so familiar, yet so painfully out of place. The officers gently moved them back and began examining the contents. Inside were only a school textbook and a roll of undeveloped film. No wallet, no notes, nothing that explained why Rachel would be anywhere near the old rail line. The absence of clues felt as heavy as actual evidence. As more officers arrived, they followed the line of trees, the patches of overgrown weeds, the narrow dirt tracks littered with footprints that could have belonged to anyone. The town rallied fast. Flyers were printed before sunrise. Local radio stations interrupted their programming to announce Rachel's disappearance. Volunteers walked the same zones multiple times, calling her name, praying for a response. But despite their efforts, the search produced nothing helpful. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no sightings. By the end of the second day, frustration began to eclipse hope. Officers questioned local workers who used nearby warehouses. They interviewed the small number of people known to wander the area. They checked records of individuals with troubling histories. Every possible angle was explored, yet every lead fizzled out. Nothing fit together cleanly. The bag had appeared, but Rachel hadn't. The film roll existed, but its meaning didn't. Fort Wayne wasn't just searching for a girl, it was searching for an explanation that refused to show itself. And with every passing hour, the silence felt heavier. By the end of the first week, the energy that fueled the town's urgency had begun to drain into a slow, painful fatigue. Every search route had been walked so often that volunteers could trace the patterns with their eyes closed. Every nearby shed, garage, and open field had been checked. Officers interviewed anyone who might have seen the smallest detail, but the answers they collected only led to blank walls. Investigators focused their attention on people with troubling backgrounds, names known for drifting through town or causing unease. They questioned them thoroughly, searching for inconsistencies, motives, anything that might connect them to Rachel's disappearance. Some leads seemed promising for a moment, but each one cracked under closer examination. The frustration grew as each interview resulted in nothing more than disappointment. Meanwhile, Eleanor barely slept. She sat at the kitchen table for hours, holding Rachel's favorite sweater, waiting for the phone to ring. Patrick tried to hold their weeks together, but the weight of uncertainty was crushing. Their home filled with visitors offering comfort, but comfort couldn't erase the ache of not knowing. Reporters began showing up, cameras aimed at the family's yard, eager for any update, yet there were none to give. The officers managing the case felt the pressure rising. They pushed harder, reviewed maps repeatedly, revisited overlooked corners, and double-checked earlier discoveries. Still, every road led nowhere. The undeveloped film sat in an evidence bag like a taunt. The fingerprint on its surface was faint, too faint for the systems of that era to read. Technicians tried multiple times to retrieve anything useful from it, but each attempt ended in the same defeated shake of the head. That small object held a secret, but in 1986, the world wasn't ready to hear it. After weeks of exhaustive effort, the pressure surrounding the investigation began to shift. The urgency dulled, the crowds thinned, the questions remained, but the answers never came. Slowly, painfully, the case transitioned from active pursuit to quiet limbo. The trail hadn't just gone cold, it had frozen solid, and everyone feared it would stay that way forever. As the weeks dragged into months, the investigation took on a bleak rhythm. Officers still checked in with the Donnellys, still reviewed notes, still revisited early interviews, but the momentum that once powered the search had drained away. The leads that once felt promising now sat untouched, weighed down by the same unanswered questions that haunted the earliest days. The Donnelly family lived through each sunrise with the ache of absence settling deeper into their lives. Eleanor stopped expecting the phone to bring good news. Patrick stopped lingering at the window at night. The hope they carried at the beginning slowly stiffened into something far heavier, something shaped by exhaustion, heartbreak, and the unbearable silence that followed every failed lead. The community also shifted. Those who had once walked through fields calling Rachel's name now whispered about the case in grocery store lines, unsure what more they could do. The posters on lampposts began to curl at the edges. The town felt smaller, dimmer, as though a part of its heart had been stolen along with the girl who never made it home. Detectives continued rechecking the evidence, revisiting the contents of Rachel's book bag over and over. That roll of film stayed sealed in its bag, waiting. The fingerprint on it was considered too faint to help, too damaged by time and handling to make sense of. In 1986, it was a problem without a solution, something noted in the file before being set aside. Eventually, the case was moved from the active board to a shelf marked with other unresolved investigations. Not abandoned, but no longer driven by urgency. An open wound preserved in paperwork. For the Donnellys, it felt like the world had simply moved on, leaving them to carry their loss alone. For the town, it marked the beginning of nearly 4 decades of wondering, fearing, questioning, and trying to forget what couldn't truly be forgotten. But the print wasn't useless. It just needed the future to speak. As the 1980s faded into the 90s, Rachel Donnelly's case shifted from a frantic search to an ache the town carried quietly. Detectives were reassigned, retired, promoted, or transferred. Each new officer who inherited the file opened it with fresh resolve, flipping through the faded photographs and typed reports, hoping to see something the last person missed. But after days of review, they always landed in the same place, staring at a wall of uncertainty that felt almost impossible to break through. The evidence didn't just sit in storage, it aged. Paper yellowed, notes smudged, Polaroids softened around the edges. And that small film canister, sealed in a thin evidence bag, waited on a shelf as the world moved forward without it. The fingerprint on its surface remained unreadable with every attempt. Technology simply wasn't ready. The Donnelly family, however, refused to let their daughter turn into a forgotten story. Eleanor carried Rachel's photograph in her purse wherever she went, gripping the edges until they frayed. She spoke her daughter's name every morning, refusing to let time steal the memory of her voice. Patrick spent years revisiting old search routes on quiet walks, moving through places that once held promise, but now only held sorrow. Small gestures kept Rachel's memory alive within the community. Candles were lit each September. A group of classmates placed flowers near the old library steps. Local churches mentioned her during evening gatherings. Even after the world changed, new technology, new trends, new people, the town held on to the shared weight of what had happened. But with each passing year, hope thinned. Detectives felt frustration grow as they rechecked the same statements again and again. Leads dried up before they even started. Every attempt to revive the investigation ended in the same exhausted conclusion. There was simply nothing left to chase. Nothing left to chase. At least, not yet. Because one piece of evidence was waiting for its moment. As the years rolled by, Fort Wayne grew, changed, and rebuilt parts of itself. Yet the absence of one girl remained a quiet thread woven through the town's identity. People raised families, opened businesses, and celebrated milestones. But whenever conversations drifted toward the past, someone always mentioned Rachel. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with a soft heaviness that never completely left. Children who were babies during the search grew into adults who had only heard stories about it, yet even they felt a strange closeness to the case. Local teachers told new students to stay alert when walking home. Families locked their doors a little earlier than necessary. The memory of Rachel's disappearance shaped the town's habits long after the search team stopped gathering. Eleanor refused to let the memory fade under the weight of time. Every year on Rachel's birthday, she placed fresh flowers near the trail where the book bag was found. Some years she stood alone. Other years, people who barely knew her joined quietly beside her, offering support through shared silence. Patrick attended community events where Rachel's name was spoken, even if it meant reopening wounds he tried to keep buried. Church groups held candlelight gatherings each September to honor her. Some residents kept a small photo of Rachel tacked on bulletin boards at work or taped to refrigerators. These gestures weren't grand, but they mattered. They kept her present in a world that continued to shift without her. Still, as time went on, reality settled in. The investigation hadn't moved in decades. Detectives cycled through the cold case files, leaving notes of regret or brief observations before handing them off to the next person. Technology grew more advanced, but the evidence from 1986 remained stubborn, still too thin for any real breakthrough. Officers spoke of the case with quiet frustration, feeling trapped by the same unanswered questions that haunted their predecessors. The truth felt frozen in place, untouched by the passing years. Yet in the middle of all that stillness, the small film canister, the one most people had stopped believing in, remained untouched, unchanged, and waiting. By the early 2000s, the Donnelly case had become a quiet test of endurance for the police department. Officers weren't indifferent, they were exhausted. Each new detective who opened the file repeated the same cycle: hope, confusion, frustration, resignation. They studied the statements, timelines, maps, and early leads until their eyes burned, but nothing ever shifted. Nothing revealed a new angle or hinted toward a missing step. It was as though the case had turned into a locked door with no key. Some detectives took the case home in their minds long after their shifts ended. A few even revisited the old sites, walking along the path Rachel should have taken to the library, trying to feel what was missed. Others spent nights staring at the box of evidence, wondering why something so heartbreaking remained so silent. The community felt this stagnation too. Over time, questions became harder to ask because the answers were always the same. People grew tired of reopening wounds that never healed. Even conversations about safety lost their energy, replaced instead with a dull acceptance that this was an injustice time refused to correct. Yet through all that, Eleanor remained the one person who refused to let the case sink entirely. She wrote letters to departments, attended town meetings, and pushed for updates even when she knew the officers had nothing new to offer. She wasn't hopeful in the way she once was. Her hope had turned into determination, the kind that came from refusing to let her daughter be forgotten by a world that had kept moving. Patrick supported her quietly, though he wrestled with a deeper grief, the kind that steals words from a man. He kept his pain tucked behind the routines, fixing things around the house, driving familiar roads, replaying the last evening he saw Rachel walk out their front door. As the 2010s arrived, the town had lived with this silence for over half a lifetime. The case was no longer active. It was simply there, a weight people carried without thinking. a story parents whispered but never understood. Still, but in the evidence room, untouched by progress and time, one object waited with quiet patience. The small film canister no one believed could change anything. By the time the late 2010s arrived, the Donnelly case felt like a wound that had been stitched and reopened too many times. Detectives handled the file with care, not because it contained fresh leads, but because it carried the weight of decades of disappointment. Some officers admitted privately that the case haunted them, not because they expected to solve it, but because they couldn't shake the unfairness of how one child's truth had slipped through so many hands. The evidence room changed over the years. Shelves were replaced, files reorganized, old storage boxes phased out. But the original items from 1986 stayed together in a single container labeled with fading ink. Inside lay the book bag, Rachel's textbook, a handful of early reports, and that small film canister sealed in clear plastic, unchanged since the night it was collected. Technicians in later years tried to revisit the fingerprint, hoping new tools might reveal something the older systems couldn't. But each time the results were the same. The print lacked enough clarity. It was frustrating, but understandable. Technology from the 1980s simply hadn't captured what modern systems needed to make a match. So the canister was returned to its place, stored behind other cases with more promising evidence. But to Eleanor, the case never lost its urgency. She continued pushing, asking questions, and attending community gatherings where Rachel's name was spoken with a tenderness that only deep loss can create. She refused to let her daughter's story dissolve into memory. Even when silence became routine, she kept her grief active, believing that somewhere, somehow, an answer still existed. The town followed her lead in their own quiet ways. Each September, a few families placed candles near the old rail line. Some residents left flowers on Eleanor's front step with no note attached. Rachel wasn't forgotten, not by those who lived through the fear, and not by those who grew up hearing her name whispered like a caution. Still, no one imagined that a detail so small, so easy to overlook, held the power to break the silence. One piece of evidence was waiting for its moment. By 2023, the cold case unit at Fort Wayne Police Department had become a revolving door of detectives trying to balance new cases with the ghosts of old ones. Most officers knew the Donnelly file by heart, its dates, its failures, its unanswered questions. They respected it, feared it, and quietly dreaded touching it again. But when Detective Marcus Bell joined the unit, he didn't share the same history with the case. He hadn't lived through its early failures. He wasn't weighed down by years of disappointment. To him, the file wasn't a reminder of defeat, it was a challenge. On his first day reviewing cold cases, he pulled the Donnelly file from the shelf. Other detectives watched with a mix of curiosity and sympathy, knowing exactly how heavy that box felt. But Bell didn't flinch. He spread its contents across his desk with steady hands, reading every report carefully, studying every photograph, tracing the timeline until he could recite it from memory. What struck him most wasn't what the case contained, it was what it lacked. There was no clear path, no meaningful suspect, no witness with solid information. Everything pointed to a girl who left her home for a routine walk and vanished without a trace. And for Bell, that kind of disappearance wasn't just troubling, it was personal. He had seen families collapse under the weight of unanswered questions before. He wasn't willing to let another one suffer the same fate. He took his time processing the evidence. While others skimmed over the film canister, seeing only a failed print and outdated technology, Bell lingered on it. He held it in his hand, analyzing the surface, wondering why every attempt to read the fingerprint had stopped short. It wasn't arrogance, just a determination shaped by years of solving cases others had abandoned. Most detectives had learned to let the Donnelly case rest. Bell couldn't. Something about that canister, small, ordinary, ignored, pulled his focus back again and again. He didn't know it yet, but that moment marked the beginning of the turning point the town had been waiting nearly 40 years to witness. The film canister had been handled by so many detectives over the years that most of them barely acknowledged it anymore. It had become part of the scenery inside the case file, an object noted, cataloged, and dismissed. But when Marcus Bell examined it, he didn't see a dead end. He saw a question that no one had truly answered. He placed the canister under a new digital scanner, not expecting much, but unwilling to assume the worst. The screen flickered as the image sharpened layer by layer. The print was faint, blurry at the edges, and interrupted by tiny marks made from decades of handling. Still, Bell stared at it with a focus usually reserved for living suspects. He adjusted the contrast, enhanced the ridges, and zoomed in again and again. Most detectives would have given up after a few minutes. Bell didn't. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for possibility. After several hours, the image stabilized enough to reveal partial ridge patterns. Not a complete fingerprint, but not worthless either. He knew modern systems could do more with less. They could analyze fractured data, compare fragments, and identify matches from relatives even when the direct perpetrator wasn't in the system. That thought sparked something inside him. He uploaded the restored print into the upgraded database. The system processed it slowly, cross-referencing thousands of profiles across state and national records. Bell waited, leaning forward, hands clasped under his chin. He wasn't expecting a miracle, just a direction, something the case had desperately lacked for 40 years. Then the screen flashed. Not a full match, a partial one. A connection, not to a suspect, but to a distant relative. Bell froze. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to start following a genetic trail. Enough to reopen a door that had been sealed shut for decades. Enough to breathe life into a case long treated like a memorial instead of an investigation. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, Rachel's story was no longer silent. The evidence was finally waking up. The partial match might have seemed insignificant to someone else, but Bell recognized its value immediately. A distant relative meant a family thread existed, one that could be traced back to someone alive, someone accountable. This wasn't a solution. It was a direction. And after 40 years of wandering in circles, a direction was priceless. Bell began building a family map based on the genetic profile the system highlighted. He worked through public records, tax documents, birth certificates, and archived databases that spanned multiple states. Each branch he uncovered added a new possibility. Each name he circled brought him closer to the truth that had dodged investigators for decades. After days of careful sorting, one small branch of the family tree stood out. It belonged to a distant cousin who lived in Ohio, a person with no criminal history, no reason to be involved, but whose DNA connected faintly to the recovered fingerprint. Bell followed that branch further, digging into siblings, children, and extended relatives. Then he found a name that stopped him cold. Silas Vance. It appeared quietly on a list of relatives connected to the distant cousin. The more Bell read, the more unsettled he became. Silas had lived in Fort Wayne at the time of Rachel's disappearance. He had been 19, old enough to understand the gravity of crime, young enough for impulsive behavior. His name hadn't appeared in the original investigation, not because he was cleared, but because he had never been considered in the first place. Bell didn't react emotionally. He simply sat back in his chair, staring at the name, feeling the shift in the air. This wasn't just another lead. It was a thread woven tightly into the heart of the case, one that investigators had unknowingly walked past for 40 years. Silas had no serious criminal record, no red flags, nothing that would have drawn attention. But his proximity to the Donnelly family made the connection impossible to ignore. Bell leaned forward again, rechecking every document, every date, every detail. The further he went, the harder it became to escape one truth. The person linked to the fingerprint wasn't a stranger. He had been part of Rachel's world. The moment Marcus Bell wrote down the name Silas Vance, the entire case shifted in his hands. It wasn't shock that hit him first. It was disbelief. Not because the lead seemed far-fetched, but because of how close it placed the truth to the Donnelly family. Silas wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a stranger drifting through town. He was the older brother of Chloe, the very friend Rachel thought she was meeting the night she vanished. Bell reread the original reports, searching for any mention of Silas. His name wasn't there. Not once. He hadn't been questioned, logged, or even considered. The early investigators had focused on outsiders, moving through a list of people who had no connection to Rachel's personal life. never imagining the danger could have been rooted so close. That realization tightened Bell's grip on the case file. If the fingerprint truly connected to Silas's bloodline, then the oversight wasn't just a missed clue. It was a devastating blind spot that had allowed a man to live freely for nearly 4 decades. Bell didn't rush to conclusions. He cross-referenced addresses, employment records, and school directories from the 1980s. Every document reinforced the same unsettling truth. Silas lived just streets away from the Donnelly home during the year Rachel disappeared. He had proximity, he had opportunity, and now, thanks to the recovered fingerprint, he had a genetic link to the only physical clue left behind. The deeper Bell looked, the louder his instincts grew. Something about Silas's life didn't sit right. He had a minor incident on record from 1991, nothing violent, nothing alarming, but it placed him near law enforcement long enough to leave some form of documentation. That alone made the genetic hit even more significant. Bell leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him. This wasn't another false lead. It wasn't a hopeful guess. It was the first real movement the case had seen in nearly 40 years. He closed the file slowly, not from hesitation, but from the understanding that everything from this point forward would change the course of the investigation. The silence of the past was finally breaking. When the warrant was signed, the neighborhood watched with a curiosity that felt almost unbearable. Silas Vance's house was the kind you saw every day. A modest front yard, a swing on the porch, a mailbox with a bent flag. It didn't look like the home of someone about to be stripped of the life he'd built. Neighbors murmured and tried to make sense of officers moving along the sidewalks, but no one could hold together the feeling that a normal morning had been broken in half. By the time the search team pushed through the back door, Silas was awake and cooperative at first, polite, steady, the sort of man who answered questions in plain sentences. The team moved quickly and precisely, cataloging and photographing each room. They took boxes down from closets, opened drawers, and tested the kind of patience trained investigators depend on. The men and women doing this work didn't act like they were surprised by what they had to do. Their faces were set from years of carrying difficult tasks. In his workshop, tucked beneath a shelf of tools, they found a small box full of old camera parts, lenses with cloudy glass, a leather strap scuffed from use, film canisters that matched the kind recovered that night in '86. Nearby sat a battered camera case and a few loose negatives yellowed with age. The equipment was ordinary. Ordinary enough that it would fit in the hands of someone who loved photography, or ordinary enough to fit in the hands of someone who wanted to keep reminders of a night he hoped no one would revisit. The most wrenching find came from a drawer in the master bedroom. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout for attention. They lifted it carefully and saw a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting, dated mostly to the mid-1980s. The words inside were personal, notes, lists, fragments of days. But one entry stood out like a raw nerve, a reference to the Elm Street Project alongside a date that matched Rachel's disappearance. That kind of detail doesn't belong in ordinary life. It belongs in the pages of someone who had been close to an event and chose to keep a memory of it. Officers photographed everything. Items were bagged. The weight of evidence grew heavier in the room with every seal they placed on a plastic envelope. For the Donnellys in the town, it was the moment the case stopped being only a file and began to feel like a reckoning. Those objects, the cameras, the canisters, the diary, told investigators what the neighborhood had suspected. Something hidden in plain sight might finally be pulled into the light. Silas sat in the interview room with the posture of a man who believed he had nothing to fear. His hands rested calmly on the table, fingers laced, the kind of stillness that made the room feel colder than it should have. He didn't ask why he'd been brought in. He didn't demand a lawyer. He simply looked at Detective Bell with a steady gaze, as if the situation were nothing more than an inconvenience. Bell didn't rush. He placed a folder on the table, took a seat, and studied the man across from him. Silas had lived nearly 4 decades without a whisper of suspicion touching his name. His life blended seamlessly into the routines of the town. Work, neighbors, familiar faces at local stores. Nothing about him suggested a man who had buried the truth of a child's disappearance. Bell began with simple questions, giving Silas room to speak freely. Do you remember Rachel Donnelly? Silas nodded. My sister's friend. Sweet girl. Did you see her the night she disappeared? A shake of the head. Calm, steady. No, I was at home. Bell kept his tone even, almost gentle. Interrogations didn't always start with pressure. They started with space. The more a suspect talked, the more they revealed about what they wanted to hide. Silas answered every question with an air of practiced certainty. His voice never cracked. His breathing stayed even. If a stranger walked into the room, they might have thought he was there to give routine information, not to face questions connected to a missing girl. But Bell watched closely. He didn't look for trembling hands or nervous glances. Silas was too controlled for that. He looked for the small shifts, the tightening of the jowl, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the moments where silence lingered longer than it should have. And those moments were there, subtle but real. After nearly an hour, Bell leaned back and closed the folder slowly, letting the silence settle. Silas finally broke eye contact, glancing briefly at the door. A small gesture, but meaningful. The interrogation had only begun. But something was already shifting, because calm can be confidence, or it can be the first sign of a man trying very hard not to crack. Detective Bell let the quiet stretch a few seconds longer, long enough to feel the shift in the air. Silas's gaze flicked back to him, guarded now, the calm slipping just a shade. Bell opened the folder again and pulled out a photograph. The restored image of the fingerprint lifted from the film canister Rachel had carried the night she vanished. He slid it across the table. Silas didn't touch it. He didn't even lean forward. His eyes lowered just enough to see it, and in that instant, Bell caught the first real sign of discomfort, a tightening in the shoulders, the kind that comes from recognizing something you hoped would stay buried forever. Bell kept his tone steady. This was pulled from Rachel's bag back in 1986. You remember the case, of course. Silas nodded once, slow. Tragic, but that has nothing to do with me. Bell didn't argue. Instead, he placed another sheet beside the first, this one showing the partial genetic match that had led him to Silas's family. We ran this through the new system. It didn't give us a full match, but it gave us a family link, a strong one. Silas's jaw clenched, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. Bell continued, not raising his voice, not pushing too hard. Your name surfaced through a relative in Ohio. Once we traced the connections, everything pointed back to you. Your age at the time, your proximity, your schedule, your history in Fort Wayne. Silas leaned back, arms crossing, defensive now. Family ties don't make me guilty. No, Bell replied softly, but fingerprints do. He opened a second envelope and revealed the enhanced analysis, the comparison of the old print with the newly processed genetic data. Technology caught up, Silas. It didn't give us everything, but it gave us enough. Silas swallowed hard. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as though the walls were listening. His breathing changed, not wild, not panicked, but heavier, slower. Why am I here? Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Bell didn't hesitate. You're here because you were the last person Rachel crossed paths with, and the evidence is finally speaking. For the first time, Silas looked away. The mask was cracking. Bell let the silence stretch again, this time with purpose. Then he placed one more document on the table, a lab report, freshly printed, edges still crisp. Before we brought you in, Bell said quietly, we processed the biological trace left on that film canister. Not just the fingerprint, the trace beneath it. Silas shifted for the first time, a small movement, barely noticeable. But Bell saw it. The DNA hit wasn't partial, Bell continued. It was direct. Silas's eyes flickered, fear or anger or both. That can't be right. It is, Bell said, and you know it is. Silas's breath caught in his throat, a sound so faint most people wouldn't have heard it. His hands, once steady, curled into tight fists against the metal table. Bell pushed the report closer, letting the weight of it sit between them. You were there, Bell said. No shouting, no pressure, just truth. The night Rachel left her home, you crossed her path. For several seconds, Silas sat perfectly still, frozen in place. Then his shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in something more complicated, a memory pulling him backward, a moment he had rehearsed in his mind for decades. His voice cracked first. She, she wasn't supposed to be out alone. Belle stayed silent. I saw her walking, Silas continued, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. I only wanted to talk. She liked cameras. I thought she'd listen. What happened next? Belle asked. Silas closed his eyes, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. She tried to walk away, he whispered. I grabbed her arm. She pulled back. It got loud. I panicked. I didn't mean to. He swallowed hard, tears forming but refusing to fall. She hit the ground. I didn't think at all. Belle didn't interrupt. Silas forced out the words he had buried for nearly 40 years. I carried her into the trees near the old rail line. I left her where no one was looking. The room fell heavy around them. Confession wasn't closure, just truth finally uncloaked. Belle leaned forward. Show us where. Silas nodded slowly, defeated. But the darkest reveal was still coming. Silas stood between two officers as they led him toward Grotto Park, his arms trembling despite the cuffs holding them steady. The sky was dimming when they arrived, casting long shadows across the dense stretch of trees he had avoided for nearly 40 years. Bell walked several steps ahead, his face tight, jaw locked, each footfall heavy with the weight of what he knew he was about to witness. The group crossed the old service path, moving deeper into the thicket. Branches snapped under their boots, birds scattered, and the air felt colder with every step. Silas slowed near an overgrown patch of brush, the kind untouched by weekend hikers or casual visitors. His breathing turned ragged. His eyes darted between the trees as if expecting the past to rise up and face him. This is it, he said quietly. His voice wasn't strong. It wasn't even steady. It was strained, like someone being forced to walk through the memory of their worst act. Officers marked the area immediately. A team swept in with gear, notifying the department and the coroner. Bell stood still as he watched them clear branches, remove layers of soil, and examine the ground where time had kept its grip for decades. Then the moment came, the one everyone feared and expected. A quiet call from one of the forensic techs. A lifted hand. A signal that they had found what no one wanted to see, but everyone had been searching for since 1986. Rachel Donnelly's remains lay exactly where Silas said they would be, still fragile and impossibly small against the cold earth. Even after 4 decades, the ache of seeing what was left of a 14-year-old child struck the officers with the force of fresh grief. Some turned away. Others stood frozen, letting the reality sink in. Bell felt his breath leave him in a slow, crushing exhale. For Eleanor and Patrick, this moment would divide their lives into 2 pieces, everything before the truth and everything after. Because finding Rachel didn't just close a chapter, it pulled a scar back open. When word spread that Rachel's body had been found, Fort Wayne felt the news like a blow to the chest. Phones buzzed through households. Doors opened across neighborhoods. People stepped outside as if drawn by the same invisible pull. The need to understand how the truth they had begged for had finally arrived after 4 decades. By the time the coroner confirmed the remains, the community was already gathered in clusters along sidewalks and porches. Some cried openly. Others stared ahead, shaking their heads in disbelief. A pain they had carried quietly for years surged back into the open, raw and sharp. The kind of pain that makes you hold your children closer, makes you question every face you once trusted. For the Donnellys, the news did more than break their hearts. It shattered whatever pieces they had managed to hold together. Eleanor sank into her chair when officers came to deliver the confirmation. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply closed her eyes the way people do when they're trying to survive a moment they've feared for most of their lives. Patrick placed a hand over his mouth, shoulders trembling, unable to speak. All the years of waiting, praying, fighting to keep Rachel's name alive had brought them to the truth. But the truth wasn't gentle. It didn't comfort. It didn't return what was taken. It only exposed how long they had endured what no parent should ever endure. The media reacted instantly. Headlines erupted online and across local networks. Fort Wayne's lost child found after 40 years. Arrest made in 1986, case that haunted Indiana. Community shaken as suspect identified as longtime resident. Reporters stood outside police headquarters. Neighbors called each other in disbelief. The air felt heavier, as if the entire city was mourning all over again. But the shock didn't end with the headlines, because once the suspect's name was released, once the town realized who had been living among them, the grief turned into something deeper, something harder to process, something that made people question everything they thought they knew about safety. And the town hadn't yet heard the most painful voice of all. When the police announced the suspect's identity, the shock rippled through Fort Wayne with a force no one was prepared for. The town had barely begun processing the discovery of Rachel's remains when the next blow landed. Silas Vance, a man who had lived among them without a flicker of suspicion, had confessed to being involved in her disappearance. But while the community struggled to understand the betrayal, one person was hit harder than anyone else. Silas's younger sister, Chloe. Chloe Vance stepped forward publicly only once, her voice faint and trembling. Cameras captured her hands shaking as she read a brief statement, each word pulled from a place of disbelief and heartbreak. "I spent years searching for Rachel with everyone else," she said, pausing to steady herself. "I never imagined someone in my own family could have been connected. My heart goes out to the Donnelly family. I am so deeply sorry. I don't know how to make sense of this, or how to accept that someone I grew up with could cause this kind of pain." Her words cut through the noise of the headlines, turning the story from a solved case into something far more painful. Because Chloe wasn't just grieving for Rachel. She was grieving the loss of the brother she thought she knew. Neighbors replayed memories with Silas like they were suddenly dangerous. The man who waved from his driveway. The man who joined block parties. The man who helped older residents clear their sidewalks in winter. He had moved through their lives quietly, unnoticed, trusted. And now they had to accept that trust had been misplaced in the darkest way imaginable. Parents who once feared outsiders now faced a far more terrifying truth. Sometimes the danger isn't a stranger. Sometimes it's someone who stands close enough to blend into every part of your world. The arrest didn't just close a case, it forced the town to confront the reality that they had lived beside a man carrying a secret that poisoned an entire generation. Stories like this teach hard truths. Subscribe so you never miss a warning sign again. In the days following the announcement, Fort Wayne found itself living inside a whirlwind of reflection and disbelief. People gathered in small groups outside grocery stores, workplaces, churches, anywhere they could share their confusion out loud, hoping someone else had an explanation that could make sense of what felt senseless. But no one did. For many residents, the realization that Silas Vance had lived among them for nearly 4 decades was almost too much to process. He wasn't a shadowy figure. He wasn't someone passing through town. He was a face people recognized at community events. A man who waved at neighbors while mowing his lawn. Someone who never drew suspicion because he understood how to appear ordinary. That was the part that cut the deepest. Parents retraced memories of letting their children walk past the Vance house without a second thought. Older residents remembered conversations with him at holiday gatherings. People who had borrowed tools from him replayed every interaction, wondering how they had missed the signs, wondering if there had ever been signs at all. Some residents felt anger rise inside them for reasons they couldn't fully describe. Others felt sick, betrayed by their own instincts. And almost everyone felt a strange chill each time they remembered how close the truth had been all along. The Donnelly home became a quiet place of mourning once more. Cards, flowers, and handwritten notes gathered on the front steps, placed there by people who had spent half their lives hoping the story would end differently. Many hadn't known Rachel personally, but her disappearance had shaped the town's identity in ways they never realized until now. The arrest didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity, painful clarity, the kind that forces a community to face the truth that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it keeps its distance just enough to avoid suspicion. And the worst part was the knowledge that while the town aged, grew, and rebuilt itself, one man carried the truth quietly, confidently, believing no one would ever uncover it. Fort Wayne would recover. Communities always do. But the memory of how long the truth lived beside them would linger in every conversation, every caution, every uneasy glance shared among neighbors. In the weeks following the arrest, Fort Wayne tried to return to its routines, but the truth sat over the city like a cloud that refused to lift. People went back to work, children returned to school, and the cycles of daily life resumed, but nothing felt the same. Every conversation carried a quiet weight. Every familiar street held a new layer of history, and every family seemed to move with a little more caution, a little more awareness, as if the town itself had taken a long breath and couldn't quite release it. Healing didn't come as relief. It came as a slow acceptance that the story they had lived with for 40 years finally had an answer. An answer that hurt as much as the uncertainty once did. Residents gathered at community centers, church halls, and small candle-lit vigils to speak aloud what many felt silently, that they were grieving more than the loss of a child. They were grieving the loss of certainty, the loss of safety they once believed they had, the loss of trust they didn't realize had been broken decades earlier. Parents found themselves watching their children more closely, not because they believed another tragedy would strike, but because Rachel's story reminded them how fragile a single moment can be. Neighbors lingered longer on their porches, checking in on one another with a new gentleness. The sense of unity was strong, but it was unity born from heartbreak, not celebration. It wasn't just the Donnelly family carrying the burden anymore. The entire town felt marked by the reality of how close the truth had been. Conversations that once drifted quickly now paused on hard questions. How do we trust again? How do we forgive ourselves for not seeing it? How do we move on when the past feels so close? Fort Wayne didn't have the answers yet, but it had begun the slow work of acknowledging the trauma openly instead of letting it linger in silence. The journey toward healing had finally started, not with closure, but with honesty. As Fort Wayne tried to steady itself, a harder conversation rose to the surface. The conversation about trust. Not the simple trust shared between neighbors, but the deeper kind that shapes a community. For decades, the town feared danger from outside its borders. Parents warned their children about strangers, about far-off threats, about places they didn't know. But the truth forced them to confront something far more unsettling, that the danger they feared had stood beside them, year after year, blending into the ordinary moments of their lives. People weren't just grieving a crime, they were grappling with the knowledge that trust isn't always broken loudly. Sometimes it erodes quietly, hidden in plain sight. And in the center of that realization stood Eleanor Donnelly, a woman who carried more endurance than anyone knew. She had lived through 40 years of unanswered questions, refusing to let Rachel's memory be swallowed by dust or time. Every birthday she honored, every candle she lit, every meeting she attended, all of it kept her daughter present in a world determined to forget too quickly. When the truth finally surfaced, Eleanor didn't react with rage. She reacted with a soft, trembling strength that silenced everyone in the room. She thanked the detectives who stayed with the case. She thanked the community that never stopped caring. But her eyes held a tiredness that spoke of decades stolen from her, years she couldn't get back, years spent waking up with the same question echoing in her mind. Where is my child? Detective Marcus Bell became a quiet figure of respect throughout the town. Not celebrated loudly, but recognized in the way people nodded at him in public spaces, in the way families whispered gratitude when he passed. His refusal to look away from aging evidence reminded the community that persistence can outpace time when someone is willing to carry the burden fully. If trust had been shaken, Bell helped restore a small part of it, not by promising safety, but by showing that truth can still rise after decades of silence. Fort Wayne learned an uncomfortable lesson. Danger doesn't always wear a warning. Sometimes it looks familiar. Long after the cameras left and the headlines faded, one truth remained at the center of every conversation in Fort Wayne. The case wouldn't have moved without the advancements in forensic genealogy. For years, detectives had stared at the same file, the same evidence, the same frustrating fragments. But science had grown in ways those early investigators could never have predicted. What once seemed like a useless fingerprint became the turning point. What once sat quietly in an evidence box became the thread that pulled an entire truth out of hiding. People spoke with awe about how a single trace, too faint to matter in 1986, had become the tool that reopened a case the world assumed was frozen forever. Community meetings filled with discussions about how modern forensic work had reshaped justice. Teachers mentioned the breakthrough in classrooms. Parents talked about it around dinner tables. The idea that the past could be recovered through new technology felt both comforting and unsettling. Detective Bell didn't revel in the praise. If anything, he seemed humbled by the outcome, often reminding people that the investigation had been carried by decades of stubbornness. Not only his, but the persistence of those who came before him, and especially the unwavering strength of the Donnelly family. Bell saw himself not as the hero of the story, but as the person who happened to be in the right era, with the right tools, at the right moment. Still, the town recognized the weight of his work. He had taken a case older than most officers on the force and refused to let it rest. He had shown that a cold case isn't truly frozen, not if someone is willing to reopen it with fresh conviction and modern eyes. But more than the science, more than the investigation, more than the reopening of old wounds, the final lesson settled in quietly. Evil isn't always a stranger. Sometimes it borrows your doorway. Fort Wayne would carry that truth forward, not as fear, but as awareness, a reminder that caution isn't paranoia, and silence is not safety. It was a hard lesson carved out of decades of pain, but it became part of how the town chose to move forward. As time passed, the town began to rebuild emotionally, though no one expected the pain to vanish completely. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning how to live with the truth. Rachel's name continued to appear in conversations, not because of the tragedy alone, but because the community grew determined to honor the life she had been unable to finish. Local schools organized small photography exhibits in her memory, inspired by her love for capturing moments. A bench was placed near the library she never reached, engraved with her name and a message about keeping watch over one another. Evening gatherings at Grotto Park became quieter, softer, filled with people who came not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Eleanor and Patrick found themselves surrounded by a town that refused to let their daughter be reduced to a file number or a headline. People brought meals, left flowers, and checked in, often, not out of pity, but out of understanding. They knew that losing a child leaves a gap that time can't repair, but they hoped that shared compassion could soften the edges. Detective Bell visited them privately once the case closed, not for recognition or ceremony, but to assure them that their daughter's story changed more than they realized. It reshaped how the department approached old cases. It influenced training, procedures, and the mindset of new officers. It became a reminder that even the smallest trace can carry a path to truth if someone refuses to look away. Rachel's legacy reached far beyond the investigation. She became the reason a community looked at one another with sharper care, the reason families paid closer attention to the quiet moments, the reason parents spoke openly with their children about safety without spreading fear. Her story reminded people that justice can arrive late, painfully late, but it can still arrive. Before we close, one question remains for everyone watching. Should justice wait 40 years? Let's talk in the comments. Rachel Donnelly did not get the life she deserved, but her name, her story, and the truth uncovered in her memory will continue to echo through Fort Wayne, a reminder of resilience, vigilance, and the power of voices that refuse to fade. And that is the legacy she leaves behind.